Hey team, I think I should be live now. How are we all? Back for another week. It's great to see. Hope you're all having a good morning or evening or afternoon, whatever it happens to be for you. All right, give me just a second and I'll crack on and get going here. Oh, my YouTube studio is refusing to come up for the moment, so give me just a second. Wow, such a great spread of people today from all over the place. Fell asleep, Mick. I'm only just waking up, mate. Rolled out of bed. Okay, so let's make a bit of a start. Oh, don't tell me the large 3 on screen. Let's get rid of that. Okay, I'm not sure what was going on there with OBS, but let's hope that doesn't come back. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is the next firmware release that's coming up pretty soon. Most of you, if you've been around the Speeduino project for a little while, will know that the releases happen. I used to do them monthly. It's kind of pushed out now. Every 2 or 3 months is now pretty typical, just because to get some of the more major features in that I'm working on usually takes a bit more than a month by the time that the work is actually done and they're tested. And the other reason that they're starting to take a little bit longer now is because there's a lot more developers coming on board. The number of people contributing now versus 6 months ago is crazy. 6 months ago it was almost all myself doing all the development work with maybe 1 or 2 others. At the moment, I mean, this firmware release will have more pull requests from other people than any that have come before it. So that's fantastic to see, but it does start to push out the development cycles just a little bit. And mean things take a little bit longer, but that's okay. It does mean that we can get some of these bigger features in that we want. So what I'm going to do today is just sort of run through what's coming up in the new firmware release, which I'm hoping to have out probably within the next, certainly within the next week, hopefully within the next couple of days. Just depends on what makes it in, what doesn't quite make the cut, what'll go in next month. I love that I can't even get 5 minutes into a video and somebody's asking about the drop bear already. That's terrific. I think every single video I post, there's at least one comment saying, hey, any updates on the drop bear? I might get to that a little bit later. So everyone's aware that the format for this stream is going to be that I'm going to run through all the firmware stuff, which is, I guess, the more formal part of this. And then following that, though, I'm just going to be sitting back and doing some coding and doing some work. So it'll be pretty chilled out. I'm just going to be working on Speeduino stuff. It'll be stuff that's all getting ready for the release. So you're most welcome to join me. I'm just going to be chatting, just going to be doing whatever. It'll be pretty chilled. I'll probably do that for maybe an hour or so. You're most welcome to stay on. If you don't want to, that's cool too. Okay, let me get myself in gear here. So I guess a little bit of what I wanted to discuss, at least initially, was around why we have the firmware development cycle that we do. A lot of different, or almost all different ECU manufacturers will have different firmwares that they release, usually not so regularly as Speeduino though. And that the reason for that simply comes down to, I think, more commercial interests. You know, a given box, once it's released, will get support, much like a phone, I suppose, throughout its support cycle. But then when new hardware comes out, the number of firmwares might start to drop on that. I try to take a different approach, and it's much more of the open source philosophy of release early and release often. It's not quite continuous releases where everything that goes into GitHub automatically flows through to through to the releases or anything like that. Although if you've ever wanted to use the development releases, you'll know that in Speedy Loader, the firmware loader tool, you can scroll all the way to the bottom of the firmware list and get master. And that's live updated every time there's a new commit made to the master branch. So you can always be using what's on the master branch without having to compile it yourself. Okay. As I mentioned before, going back a little while, I tried to do these monthly. It did push out a little bit just to make my life a little bit easier for myself, but at most I try to do these every 3 months now. And so a release simply means that I'm going to take all the work that's been done over the last couple of months, I'm going to snapshot it at a certain feature point and say, okay, no more big features coming in, no more big changes. This is where I'm going to work to make stable, and I'm going to start doing all my bug testing. I'm going to do more on-car testing. I'm going to do more of the bench testing that I normally do. And from then on, we're just going to work through and hopefully make everything stable. Hopefully this is going to connect for us. And so that's why we have these release cycles, just to make sure that everything's been nice and stable before release. And it also gives me a chance to say, okay, here's all the new features that have come out. If you're interested in any of these particular features, hey, you should consider upgrading or updating. Is Speeduino ever going to stop adding features? Probably not. Actually, I'll go into a little bit later on this, one of the reasons why it may have started to slow down at some point, but how I've worked around that. So it secures a pretty good future for Speeduino at the moment. Okay, my Arduino is actually not connecting here, which is a little bit odd. It doesn't make too much difference for the moment. I can show you through some of these features offline, but I'm a little bit curious that doesn't want to connect. Okay, so as I mentioned, there is more videos coming in, more pull requests coming in from any other people or this month than any time previously, which is just amazing. That is a little bit of a double-edged sword in that it does mean that there's a lot more testing that's required. As people get up to speed with the code base and get a little bit more comfortable with it, they start to understand the impacts of the changes that they're making, but before that time, it's not always obvious what's going on. So it does tend to introduce a lot more bugs and things, and that's okay. But it's something that needs to be considered, and we make sure that we're covering off with every different pull request. And sometimes that's why that these pull requests do take a little bit longer to come through than what a lot of people I think might prefer. All right, the first thing I'm going to be showing you today is the new engine protection feature. So there's always been RPM limiters and things like that. Oh, that's a bit ugly. RPM limiters and things like that. But now I'm formalizing this into a little bit of a more centralized, I guess, way of doing this. And so we've got this new engine protection and limiters dialog. Now this isn't complete yet. There's a couple of tweaks that I need to make to the user interface here. But in short, it gives you one spot to view all of your engine protections and one way of managing that wasn't there previously. So if we say, hey, we're going to turn on protection, we're going to have it be spark only, fuel only, or both. Let's say we're going to do both. Engine protection RPM minimums. So this is where that the engine protections will be gauged from. So if we're going to say 2500, below 2500, the car will run normally, regardless of the situation that's going on with any of these other areas. And that's just essentially a basic method of not cutting the engine out. When you have any of these protections kick in, you might want the engine actually turning off, but more likely you're just going to want the engine cutting back to a safe level. So you could make that 1500 and the car would essentially just drop back to idle if any of these protections kick in. The cut method, either rolling or full cut. Now, the rolling methods had a lot of work that didn't work particularly well in the past, in my opinion. and I always had a little bit of trouble with it myself, but that's been revamped, and that's had a lot more work done to it and works quite well now. So full cut though, we'll just cut everything off. The rolling cut obviously only affects ignition, whereas the full cut will turn both fuel and ignition off if you've selected both up the top. Below that, we've just got a few indicators. So at the moment, we're simply saying that the engine protection is off everywhere. And we've got over here simply the rev limiter, the boost cut limiter, and each of these obviously can be turned on and off individually, except for the rev limiter. The rev limiter is always considered to be active. The boost limiter has always been there. It's now just been centralized in this overall engine protections. And we've got the oil pressure protection here as well. The Afr protection is coming. It's not quite ready and it's not in this dialog yet, but it's going to be in the firmware release, so it won't be too far away at all. Bear with me in the background. I'm just going to do an upload to my board here just to make sure that it's actually got a working firmware on it. Eventually. And the oil pressure protection. This is one that I spoke about in a stream a little while back. Actually, I ran through the introduction of this and how we made the oil pressure readings happen. And this is simply the protection side of it. So it's not available at the moment, you'll see, and that's because I probably don't have the oil pressure turned on, which is true. So I turn that on. Let's assume those are all good settings. And I can come over and I can now turn this on. And this will simply say, or gives us a table of minimum oil pressure versus RPM. One thing that people have requested here is the addition of a delay. So a number of seconds before that occurs. So if you're at 6,000 RPM and the oil pressure drops to 5, that it'll wait 2 seconds or 1 second before that kicks in. And I will be adding that within the next couple of days. So that's a fairly easy one to add. But that's the engine protection setup. It's a nice little addition, and it will grow with more things going forward as well. Turn him off. Now, I'm not going to mention every single feature or every single bug that's been fixed during this release cycle, because we'd all be here forever. So I'm just going to run through a few of the bigger ones though. One that I know has caused a few people a little bit of grief is with the TPS calibration. There's not really much to see on this one. But in the past, if you've had your wires swapped on the TPS, you could calibrate it and you'd get a warning saying that they're probably backwards, as in this number was higher than this number. And you could simply swap the wires and that would fix everything. But I had hoped that you could make it so the calibration would work in both directions. And I thought I had that, but somebody came to me and said, hey, this is not working. And I fixed a little bug around that. So that's a nice little one in case you happen to be wired up that way. That's simply going to work properly now as opposed to just being broken. There's been the introduction of a couple of new decoders. The biggest one that I've been working on has been around the 420A pattern. Now I know that I ran through this on a stream a little while back. There's the potential that there might be one more pattern pulled in for this release cycle. There's one sitting in a pull request at the moment. I'll have to see how that works out. I'm not sure if that'll make it in yet. See how we go. But there's always new trigger patterns going in, or seemingly always new patterns coming in. What have we got next? Oh, support for Teensy 4.1 has gone in. Many of you may have seen the video I did a few weeks back around running Speeduino with a 600 megahertz processor in the drop bear. So that's a drop bear board there, and that's actually got the Teensy 4.1 chip plugged into it. And the code for that, or the support for that, is now in the firmware. I need to try and get a feel for how I'm going to manage this going forward with Speeduino, in terms of how Speedy Loader is going to actually be able to update systems that aren't AVR. Certainly it will be supporting the TNC 3.5 because that's the target chip within the drop bear board. But I will consider whether it supports other architectures as well going forward. Am I going to upload, stream, record to YouTube? So these streams on YouTube are automatically recorded, and you can go back and watch these anytime after they've happened. So that's fine. ZN3, what is the question? Yeah, what is the relationship? Sorry, being made between C and C++ in the firmware? Well, formally the firmware is C++ simply because a lot of the Arduino libraries in the background are using C++. Essentially all of the actual firmware code that I write though is pure C, and there is a couple of reasons for that, but it tends to be neater in my opinion. So I think there's a misconception around a little bit that Arduino is its own special language and its own limited thing. That's not the case. Speeduino is just C and C++. You can write straight C and straight C++ within any of your firmware and it'll run just fine. All the Arduino environment is doing is adding a bunch of libraries and frameworks around that. So it's adding to C, not subtracting from it or anything like that. Okay, getting to the first of the big user contributed items here. Let's close this off. A contribution here from Timu5, and Timu's name is Matuts Mazinski, I think it is. My sincere apologies for absolutely butchering that name. But the addition that he made was the water and methanol injection, which has come in this month. Now this is the first time actually because there was a bounty sitting out there for this on Bounty Source. And this is the first time that any of the bounties have been claimed by a third party. So that's a big milestone. I reckon that's really cool. I haven't actually set it up on this machine. So all of the values are just sitting at the default here. But you can see it's got everything that you'd expect in terms of the options for water or meth injection. This is all done properly. One of the things that held me back on doing this myself was that you can do water injection in a really sort of basic, crappy way, just basically injecting water, untimed and unpulsed and those sorts of things. And there are some setups out there that do that. If you buy a water injection kit, you'll quite often get a controller that's basically just dumb. It's just going to inject water when you flick a switch and you reach a certain TPS or something. But I wanted it to be done properly in this, which is so that the pulses were going to be synced, that they would run at a proper frequency, that you could do ignition correction and those sorts of things when it was on. Obviously these values aren't set right, but you get the idea of what's going to be possible here. And this is a really great implementation. I've been testing it. It's not something I've ever personally run on a car, but I did a lot of reading on the theory behind it and how it should work and when it works best. And this has got everything that I wanted to see in it. It's been flagged as experimental for this month, which is not unusual for a new feature. But it's great to see that that's gone in and people could start playing and having a test with it now. So yeah, big thank you to Timu who made that contribution. It's a great one to have, and it's a pretty substantial one to have in there too. Let's see if this will connect yet. Hey, there we go. It does help if you put a working firmware on your board, doesn't it? Okay. One of the guys who's contributed for quite some time now is Vitor. Some of you, if you've been on Slack, will have seen him before. He's put through a lot of pull requests. He's still got a few outstanding in Vitor. I will get through those before we do the release, possibly even today, actually later He's made another great contribution around the addition of closed loop VVT to the missing tooth pattern. The closed loop VVT work started to go in a little while back, but it was limited to the later Miata or MX5 controls. He's extended that out to work with missing tooth setups as well. Obviously needing a cam trigger along with that missing tooth, but it's great to see that that's been incorporated for that pattern now as well. Let's turn that one off. Just to configure this so we've got a running system at the moment. I've done a lot of work this month as well around the serial comms and the speed at which they're operating at. If you've ever watched the loop counter in Speeduino, you'll see that it's typically running at about anywhere between sort of 850, 900 and 1000. This is a bit of an exceptional case. It's running a little bit faster here than anywhere else, but there's been some big improvements around this. Quite a number of the decoders are running faster than they were, and there's also been some big serial comms improvements so that it runs a lot faster than it did before as well. But yeah, this 1200 loop count, whilst it doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of performance, that the system will still keep doing the same thing it always did, it means we've got a little bit more CPU overhead than what we had in the past, which just means that there's more things that we can do than we could in the past. Like I said, this one is running a little bit higher than some other patterns. If I was to load up for example, a 60-2 wheel, it would drop down a little bit simply because there's more interrupts going on. But it's always good to see those little tweaks and things going in, and they're starting to be a little bit harder to find. That the code base is pretty well optimized and has been for a while, but these serial comms improvements and decoder tweaks have made a pretty substantial difference, which has been great. Okay, let me just catch up with chat. Peter, awesome you added V8 sequential, but noticed there was no cylinder trim adjustment for this yet. Is this coming? Yes, it will be coming. It's been, if I'm honest, pretty low on the priority list. I'm not sure I've seen, I'll be brutally honest, a single user yet who's running the individual cylinder trims even on a 4-cylinder. So it's not a feature that's actually in high demand. I think people like to see it on the feature list and go, yeah, that's a cool feature to have, but not a lot of people actually use it, or not that I've seen. If I'm wrong on that, so be it, and by all means tell me I'm wrong, but it's not a feature that I've seen in big demand, to be honest. Do I ever see Speedy having emissions controls in the foreseeable future? Probably not. I mean, a lot of emission controls simply come down to tuning anyway, but there are a couple of additions I could make. I know it's important for some people in terms of emissions testing and those sorts of things, but it's something that's very difficult to add and starts to get into a bit of a grey area, particularly around OBD. A lot of those emissions tests simply plug into an OBD port, read the OBD data, and hey, that's your emissions results straight away. The problem with that is that unless you are fully certified and fully licensed to do OBD outputs, it's actually quite illegal in most jurisdictions to be doing OBD yourself, and that's why you won't see it on most aftermarket ECUs, because it's a very difficult thing to certify and would never be certified on something like Speeduino. That the costs are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. What about boost by gear? Any progress? It's coming. It's not going to make it into this firmware release, Martin, which is unfortunate. I had hoped to get it in, but it will, I absolutely, cross my heart, be in the next firmware release. I've started the work around it, but unfortunately it just didn't quite get there for this month or for this cycle, but it won't be far away. Actually, touching on that, the VSS that went in last month, the vehicle speed support, I put that in as a testing type feature and it worked okay. I've certainly received some good feedback from people though around how well it's worked, and I've done my own some further testing on my own car. There's been a few improvements made to that. This is now doing a slightly different sampling method than what it was doing previously, and the results seem to be much smoother than they were. So I'm a bit, I'm much happier with how that's working now than what it was in the past, and that actually feeds into to that boost by gear comment, because until you get a nice stable VSS reading that's not bouncing all over the place, then you can't do proper gear detection. If you can't do proper gear detection, then it makes it really difficult to do boost by gear. There will be other gear detection modes coming as well. I've been playing around with the various switch modes. Again, it's not going to be something that makes it into this firmware release, but will be coming in the future. So for anyone who's using VSS, give it a shot in the new firmware release. You should find it's quite a bit smoother than it was, and that's not just around the smoothing factor either. The sampling method has changed and seems to be working a lot better. Ooh, okay. All right. The next one is another addition from Vitor, or Vitor. I really do hope I'm pronouncing these names right and not absolutely butchering them. But it's a feature that's been asked for a little while, and is a massive one that has taken a little while to do, and has had a bunch of prerequisites in the firmware that needed to be in place before it could be pulled in. But it is, and this is very much subject to change in terms of a UI output, in terms of the user interface, but programmable outputs. There's 8 different channels here. So these are basically freeform outputs that you can use and say, okay, we're going to have this one, pin number 3. We're going to call it, let's call it shift light. And we're going to say, okay, if, and we can choose all of the different status items that we have here, all the live feeds. We're going to choose, RPM. I swear I saw it before. There it is. And we're going to say if RPM is greater than 5500, change that to active high. And we're going to disable the secondary clause. So all that would do is say, okay, on pin 3, when the RPM is greater than 5500, pin number 3 is going to go high. So you could wire then pin 3 up to an LED or a light or a relay or anything that you wanted, and then you could have a shift light, for example. This kind of generic programmable type outputs mean that you don't need a specific a targeted function to be in the firmware. You can simply set it up for yourself, given the conditions that you're after. Now, one thing, and this is working really great, and it's been a huge contribution. Hey, you're on the stream. It's great to see you, man. And thanks for this one. What I'm actually going to be working through, and I might even do it later if you like, we can do it live. I'm going to be reworking this this user interface a little bit. It's a bit congested, I think. So I'm just going to be neatening that up, and I've got some ideas for how that's going to look, so we might run through a little bit later. But that's a great addition, and a lot of people have asked for this sort of thing in the past. So it's great to see that we can get that in place now, and that you can really start customizing the outputs to do exactly what you need them to do yourself. Oh, yeah, perfect. There's a delay on the end as well, so there's a time factor before that kicks in, and we can set that to be whatever we want. Cool. Yeah, so thanks for that, man. That's been a great addition. One of the things that this was dependent on, let me just turn that off before I forget about it, was the fact that, and this touches upon a point that someone raised earlier, that will updates ever stop for Speeduino? And the answer is no, they're not ever going to stop. Not as long as I'm working on it, which I plan to be for a long time. I can get into, if I can ever make this my full-time job or anything like that, it'd be amazing. But even if it's not, I have no plans for changing that the work that I'm putting in at the moment. But even outside of what work I'm doing, we're still limited by what hardware capacity we have. And that's always going to be a reality of life. And that's something that had started to become not a concern, I guess, but a factor in terms of new features, was how much RAM and how much EEPROM we had left on the old Mega 2560. In previous firmwares, if I spun up the old firmware here, the free RAM amount would be running at somewhere around the 350 bytes mark. And whilst it's not quite the same as on a PC, where if you get to where you always have to leave a certain amount free, or you still do have to leave a certain amount free here for local variables, but you can run quite close to zero. But even so, that was starting to become a concern, and it meant that there was no real space left for big tables. There was nowhere we could put, a secondary ignition table. We've got the secondary fuel table that went in a few months ago, but we couldn't necessarily have a secondary ignition table, just as an example. As part of a discussion happening, I think nearly 3 months ago, because I think it sort of started on one of these streams and then continued on Slack afterwards, there was a discussion around how we might potentially be able to change the way the calibrations were working. So the calibrations that I'm referring to here are your temperature sensors and the O2 sensor calibrations. Both of these are baked in, I guess, a little bit into Tuner Studio with how they work. Although, as I've learned over the last few months, there is a little bit of flexibility in this. But in short, they sent a great big chunk of data in the order of 1 kilobyte or more for the temperature ones, and sort of half a kilobyte for the AFR readings or the AFR calibrations through that had to be stored. Now, those numbers don't sound big, but on a system that only has 8K of memory and 4K of EEPROM, that's a pretty big chunk of what you're needing to work with. So I had a bit of a rethink about how this could be done, and the way this worked in the past was to say, okay, if you've got a 10-bit ADC, so analog to digital converter, that means that it will return values between 0 and 1023, and it sent a chunk of calibration data for every single one of those points. So 1023 chunks of data or points of data, and that's your 1 kilobyte. Now Speeduino was actually cutting those down a little bit and trimming those to save a little bit of space, but what I've done for this firmware release is change that significantly and bring it down to an actual proper interpolated table. So instead of having literally 1 point for every, or 1 temperature reading for every single ADC reading, I've actually pulled it into a 2D curve, much like we would see a warm-up curve or something like that. We have a curve like this where the spots in between 2 points will get interpolated. That's now what we're doing for calibration as well. And it means, after quite a bit of testing to figure out what the best size of those tables was going to be, that we can move from, instead of having 512 points for each sensor, so 1 for the coolant, 1 for the inlet air temperature, and 1 for the AFR sensor, instead of having 512 points for every one of those, we've now got just 32. Now it's not quite as simple. There's a little bit of overhead and other things going on, but if you look at the free memory graph over here, you'll note that it's shot up to 929, and that's after things like the programmable outputs have already gone in. So, and they used up, I think 128 bytes of memory or something like that off the top of my head. So we've now got a whole heap more RAM and a whole heap more EEPROM as well to be able to play with. That means that we can begin to add a lot of the more memory intensive things, such as a second ignition table, for example, that would not have been possible in the past. So that's been a big chunk of work to get right. In particular, when you upgrade your firmware, for example, it's got to convert from the old model to the new model, and it does that seamlessly in the background now. So that's all working fine, which is terrific. but it's been a lot of work to get to the point where it reads identically to what it did in the last setup. And in fact, the temperature readings, once you load your firmware up, you might notice them move by maybe 1 degree in some cases. They're actually more accurate now than they were in the past, which is a bit of a quirk of how this all shook out. But they are actually better representations of the values than they were before. Again, it's very, very small. We're talking in the order of 0.5 degree to 1 degree. So very, very small. But, you know, everything's an improvement. Oh, a lot of chat going on here. Yeah, Speeduino is of course open source and always will be. That's never going to change. Dual or multiple AFR inputs. You can have multiple AFR inputs today, although the interface to do that is a little bit sloppy. The code is there in the background. What you can't have today is multiple calibrations. So it will always assume that you're going to be running 2 of the same wideband controllers. And I don't think I'm really going to change that in the future. I think I'm just going to make that hard requirement and say, look, really, if you're going to want 2 wideband sensors, don't make them 2 different ones. It's possible to put in negative crank angles, crank advance angles. Sort of. I mean, yes, you can do it in terms of making the overall ignition advance negative. And in terms of the table, we can set a negative value. Yep. There's a lot of modifiers that will pull ignition timing. And that's why you generally wouldn't set a negative value within the ignition table, although you may if you're crazy. And everybody likes pops and bangs, right? But normally you would have positive values in your ignition table or your spark table, but then you have modifiers that can pull things back, and they can pull it back beyond 0, which is why you typically would get your negative values. So just in terms of what I was talking about for the for those calibrations, I know nobody likes looking at spreadsheets, and spreadsheets are the absolute worst thing in the world, and that's fair enough, but I'll just run through this quickly. This is the original data that we see going into Speeduino, so an ADC value, and they run all the way from 0 down to all the way at the bottom, 1023. And this is taken directly from a dump that Tuner Studio produces, and these are the exact values that we're getting sent through to the board. It actually only sends one of these columns and assumes the rest, but that's the data that's going through. This then gets chopped down, or in the new version, we're running the 2D table. This one's consolidated down to 32 blocks now. I was actually experimenting with a 33 block table just for experimentation, and we can see that the values here are going to align to whatever's going on over here. So when we've got an ADC value of, say, what's going to be a good one here, let's see if we can find one of the lines. Probably that one. No, actually, I'm not going to run through that. That might be a bit too boring for this stream. But in essence, you'll see that an array index of 1 now will correspond to what an old ADC value of 32 was, simply because that was, if we're running 32 bins in our 2D table, 1024 divided by 32 is 32. So we get the old value being sent of 2596 or 259.6 in Fahrenheit, and we see the same value here. But every point from 0 down to 32 now would simply be interpolated. And there was a whole series of validations to see how big that was, or how close that was, what the error value was, what the maximum interpolation error was, all those sorts of things. But this is just some of the backing behind how that works. Thank you so much for the donation. I really appreciate that. Yeah, there is Super Chat available, by the way, in YouTube. It's not something that I've really played with that much, but it does mean you can get your own, you know, icons and GIFs and things in the YouTube chat if you're interested in it. All right, but yeah, the upshot of all of that is that we get a system that's got a whole bunch more free memory and lets us really consider a bunch of new options that I hadn't, or that weren't possible in the past. And that's going to come back to things like the 8-channel individual cylinder trim. Would not have had enough memory to do that before. But even on the AVR 2560, we've now got enough memory for it, even if we don't have the outputs to do the V8 sequential anyway. Cool. What it will enable, if I can manage to get my tongue working, is things like the secondary ignition table, and it's not going to make it in for this month, but it will be a high focus for next month. I had hoped to get that in for this month, but I've only got the new calibration mode working within the last week or so, to the point where everything was working, the update was working, and all those sorts of things. So it's going to miss it for this cycle, but it will mean that it goes in next cycle, and it will mean that we could get things like the programmable outputs pulled in this month, because we've now got enough free RAM to do it. All right. In terms of the major features of this firmware, that's really covering it off. That's the big ones that have gone in. Like I said, that there's always a whole bunch of bug fixes and things that happen in the background, and I will obviously document all of those in the release notes that I pulled together for the firmware. But that's most of what I wanted to run over in terms of the new firmware, where, as I suspected, I thought this one might be a little bit shorter, and it has been so far. Does anyone have any questions about, you know, what's going on with that firmware, what the direction of the firmware is for the next month, how any of these features might work? Happy to chat about it. Otherwise, I'm just going to go on and start having to play around and doing some of my work, really. How many free analog inputs are on the 0.4.3C board after using the clutch and secondary barrow? That's a good question. So the clutch shouldn't be an analog input. That should just be a digital input, so you don't need to use that. But there's still quite a number of free analog inputs on the Mega itself. You're testing my memory here, but from memory, there's only 2 broken out with filtering and protection on them. So if you use one of them for an external barrow sensor, then you would have 1 left. You can break the other ones out if you want as well. You'd probably just need to look at adding your own filtering and protection on those lines. But there are 2 broken out on that board from memory. Yeah, external SPI flash is certainly an option as well. Yep. That's perfect for storage. Doesn't help quite so much in terms of the RAM usage. One of the philosophies, I guess, that I've always liked. Seth, thank you so much for that donation. I truly do appreciate it, man. One of the philosophies I've had with Speeduino is that I wanted you to always be able to take a single board, whether it be a Teensy or an Arduino or what have you, plug in, load a firmware, connect it to Tuner Studio and start playing around already. Obviously, you can't run a car without having, you know, the actual Speeduino board on top of it with all your drivers and protections and those sorts of things. But it was a big part of my philosophy that I wanted everything to be able to run just on the board itself. Once you start looking at external flash, that becomes a little bit trickier, and you can do it on some of the, you can do it on one of these STM32 blackboards, because they've got the flash chip built onto them as well. So you can say, hey, just take this board and load the firmware and it'll be fine. But if you're going to work with an Arduino and say that you're now dependent on flash memory, you can no longer get away with simply saying, load the firmware, load a tune, and you're good to go, because you don't have that flash chip there to work with. So yeah, flash is certainly an option, but it comes with its own limitations and difficulties, I guess. VSS set up for miles per hour too. No, I don't think so. I don't think I ever got around to that. I had meant to. You can input as pulses per mile, and you could last month as well. That's actually a really good question. Vehicle speed. I think I've only got a gauge there for kilometers an hour. I can easily add a gauge there though for adding miles per hour. In fact, I'll promise you that I'll add a miles per hour gauge for this firmware release, because that's a really simple one. Damn! Oh, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate that. Hey, I'd love to see the sticker showing up there in the chat as well. What's the most experimental feature you've ever considered adding to Speedy? Ever looked at spark plug ionization? Look, I've looked at spark plug ionization in the sense that it's curiosity. It's not something I've ever really considered adding though. It's a nice experimental type feature, as you say, but yeah, it's not something that I'm really looking at. No, I know the Rust CFI guys have been interested in it and have been playing around with it, but it's not something that ever got a lot of mainstream OEM support. I know there are one or two instances out there from Saab from memory, but it's not something that I'm ever going to look at adding. Oh man, you're getting specific here. Greetings from Brazil. I'd like to know if PR332 will be incorporated into the new firmware. Okay, this is one that Vitor queried me on last night, and I haven't replied yet because I was too sleepy and I was also watching the F1. 332 and one other one, 347 I think it is off the top of my head, are ones I'm going to look at for inclusion. I can't make any promises, but they will be looked at for this release. In fact, I might even look at them a little bit later. We'll see how we go. There's the other great question from Martin, always around Speedy Knock. Yes, Knock will, once Knock comes in, and I finally get around to doing something with Speedy Knock, yes, it will be an engine protection feature as well. No updates on Speedy Knock though at the moment. Honestly, with the firmware work and the drop bear work, I haven't had a chance to play with it. Once I get drop bear to the beta phase, then maybe I can start having a look at it again. And that's probably going to be a couple of weeks away. Yeah. An odometer, that's a really good question. I hadn't, so the question here is around, we've got VSS now, can we have an odometer? I hadn't even considered that. That's a really interesting one. I'll consider it. I don't know. I'll have to have a think about how difficult that would be to implement. I don't think it should be too hard though. Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. We can add an odometer feature. 347, was my memory working? Was that the right number? Let's have a look. So guys, just for everyone's reference, this is probably a good place to end the formal stream and say, okay, we're not going to talk too much about the firmware, and I'm just going to start working my way into development mode here. So by all means, feel free to stick around. Well, we've got 66 people on the stream at the moment. That's terrific. I think that's as many as we've ever had. I'm just going to start working through the stuff that I was going to have a play with. By all means, I would absolutely love you guys to hang around, have a chat. But that probably is a good spot to end the formal stream in terms of what the new firmware features are going to be. Like I said, more than welcome or love for you all to hang around. But it'll be a little bit of a different pace going forward on the stream now, as I just move over to working on things. So thanks guys, appreciate you coming along. If you want to stick around, that's cool. Are we close to having sequential fuel and spark in 3.5 10C versions 6 and 8 cylinder? It's been there for a long time. Yeah, well, okay, it's been there for 6 months in that firmware already. So yeah, for 10C 3.5, the firmware support is already there for 6 and 8 cylinder sequential. It's just that the hardware support hasn't been there because there hadn't been a 10C 3.5 unit with that many outputs until the drop bear comes. So Michael, I'm not sure if you missed it. Yeah, was I successful in freeing up more space in the RAM? Yeah, I certainly was. So it's gone from about 350 odd bytes free now up to 929 bytes free, and that's after the programmable inputs went in, which chomped up about, I think, 128 bytes as well. So in the end, it freed up. I think it freed up nearly, or a little bit over. Oh no, not quite. It freed up about 900 bytes, I think, from memory. Some of which have already been used. Pull requests. What do we got? Make that a bit bigger for you guys. So the ones that people are interested in: 347, 332. Okay, so the introduction of fixed map multiply. This is to change the way the map multiply, or add an option to change the way map multiply works. So instead of comparing it to barrow pressure, it compares it to just a flat 100, if my memory is working. Let's have a look at the code. Yeah, so we're simply doing that now. Yeah, and instead of doing it via barrow. Oh man, thank you for the second donation. How good are you? I love that so much. Thanks for that, Derm. So instead of dividing by barrow here, or always dividing by barrow, if that option's turned on, we're going to do a check and either divide it by a fixed 100 or the barrow value like we do today. I'm okay with this pull release, pull request, I should say. The only thing I'm thinking is that you've added it as a new option here, which is cool. Let me look. 6. Yeah. Okay. So it's been added as a new option. What I'd like to look at is, and it'll depend on what the memory around it's like. Is where we've got multiply V value by B by map barrow ratio. I'm wondering, instead of a yes no here, whether we have we change this to be simply multiply V value by map, and then say no by barrow or by 100. I wonder if it would be better to simply have it as one option rather than adding another drop down. I think it's just a bit neater. Let's just have a look. Make this a little bit bigger for you guys again. Yeah, okay. So annoyingly, we've used up all the bits in that particular one. I wonder if we've got any free anywhere. Could make it this one here, couldn't we? Yeah, I know it does, Vida, but we would change the description there. So instead of saying multiply V value by map barrow ratio, we'd simply would simply say multiply V value by map ratio 2 and then have barrow or 100 there. I'm just thinking it works out a little bit neater. All right, let's pull this in. Assume it's clean. Oh, no, we've got a conflict. Let's have a look. We'll pull this one in and then start looking at making the changes. Yeah, so Jeffrey, I'm thinking the same thing. You know, a preference for a single drop down rather than multiple ones. Yeah, okay. So for anyone who hasn't seen a conflict resolution in GitHub before, this is happening simply because there's been other changes go on in this part of the INI file since the pull request was submitted. So, by the way, for anyone interested, the purpose of having the multiply map versus 100 versus barrow, or as a ratio of against 100 versus a ratio of barrow. Personally, I think barrow is the better option. I think it makes more sense. However, there's other ECUs on the market, also using Tuner Studio as a coincidence, that use 100, and having the option to select as a ratio to 100 would mean that we can copy over fuel tables directly from those ECUs and set this as kind of a compatibility mode. So let's merge that one. Yeah, interesting question, Dylan. The include AFR versus incorporate AFR. I'm on the fence with this one at the moment. There's a moderate chance that include AFR will simply be removed entirely or hidden somewhere away as a legacy option. There's not actually a great argument for using the include AFR one, the incorporate AFR, which is a new option here, and I forgot to mention that on the stream actually, but the incorporate AFR actually works a lot better. So I'm not sure there's a really great argument for keeping the include AFR. Okay, so I'm just going to do a git pull on my end. We should see this update in a minute. Oh, hang on. I've got a local conflict here. Bear with me a moment. So just so you're all seeing what I'm doing, if I do a pull in GitHub now, I've got local changes in Speeduino.ini that need to be committed, and that's okay. Let's have a look. Okay, so this is some of the early work that I've done in redoing the Programmable Outputs dialog. Let's just call this test work on. We'll just do that so I can do this pull in. So any way to do a translate between the two? Not really, because you'd have to have a nominal barrow value there to be able to translate against. If you put something in, say, you know, what's your typical barrow reading, you could put it in and then do a translate, but you couldn't do it without knowing a nominal barrow reading to translate against. Okay, so we've now got our fixed map multiply option in here. It's in page 1. The other one just down here. Okay. All right. Let's shuffle these around then. And let's have a single option here. How we do this? We'll make that one. So I'm just increasing the size of this one and getting rid of this last unused bit. So we're now going to have 3 options: off, barrow, fixed, and invalid. Now what I like to do is just call this one, I was going to say call this one something different so we can pick up every instance of it, but it's not widely used. So I don't think that should be a big deal. So I've made the update, that memory update in the INI file. We need to make the corresponding change in globals. Let's get the old option here. It's now 2. Get rid of the unused one. That's no longer valid. Call this one old or something for now. We'll need to change the dialogue here as well. Fixed. Just comment that out for now. And we'll need to update these tooltips and everything as well. Okay. Hey Josh, thanks for the donation. Really appreciate that, dude. Comment that fill out for now. That language clear to everyone? Multiply VE value by map ratio 2. It's not the greatest wording, is it? How about we just keep it as that now? So if we have a look at what that actually means, load in the new INI. So we just got a warning there to say Yeah, okay, so it didn't have an option for that, and that's cool. Ugh. Okay, so we've now got a table that reads off, barrow, and fixed. That's cool. I think that's the better way to do it. I think it's just a little bit neater that way. But we're going to need to update the code to reflect that. Okay. So we look where it's primarily being used, which is down here in the pulse width calculation function. Now what I'm actually going to do is just define a couple of enums for it. Let's just shove them in here. I'm just going to say multiply map mode off 0. So all we're doing here is saying that we're just giving some names to things. So rather than always having 0, 1s and 2s as a comparison, we're going to have some actual unique numbers. Barrow was 1. And 100 was 2. Actually, let's go that one. Okay, so down here we're actually using this. We'll do it this way, and we'll say config multiply map value equals mode 100. In fact, we can get rid of this first if, can't we now? Get rid of that entirely. I say there's a somewhat weird experience coding sort of with people watching on. It's like an extreme version of pair programming. It's a little bit odd. And we need to do something similar down here again as well. Oh no, I left a semicolon. Where did I leave my semicolon? I'm sure the compiler will tell me when I hit the compile button. I think that all looks okay. Yeah, I think that all looks okay. That's doing what we want. So basically we're saying that if the multiply map equals the 100 mode, we're going to do this, and I'm not going to go into why we do this, but we do some level shifting here, or not level shifting, but we uplift it to a higher value just for some resolution. We either divide by 100 or we divide by the barrow reading. I think that all looks okay. Let's check if that compiles. I assume it probably will. unless I've missed that stray semicolon somewhere. I'll drink some of my cold coffee. So that gives us the very rudimentary basis of what we're doing here. And we can probably, yep, that all worked. We'll upload that to the board and just test it and see if it makes the expected difference here. I'm not sure. This particular test rig does not have a map sensor attached, so we're going to get a bit of a bizarre barrel reading anyway, I suspect. But there's a couple of other things that we're going to need to clean up here. The first is in the updates. We're going to need to make it so that anyone who had the old option turned on, or the old option turned off for that matter, has the new option migrated to it. So we go into the update section and we look in the one for this version of the firmware. I'm going to make a comment and say new multiply map option added. And we'll go in. We had our old one here. I'm just going to make the new one equal to whatever the old value was, which should be enough for now. Oops. Did I forget to change the bit count value, did I? No, so I've changed it to 2. It was 1 there. And then I removed the extra one off. So this one here should be, that should make up 1 byte there. 2, 4, 5, 6, 8. 8 bytes. That one's still 1, even though it's the old one. So it's still there. It's just now not being used for anything. Let's have a look in here. Do something like adding a decoder. I'm not adding decoders at this late stage of the cycle, of the release cycle. Not new ones anyway. There's one pull request Vita. I know it's outstanding. It's in the back of my mind. We might have a look at that one later. We'll see how we go. A plug and play for GM throttle body injectors. Nothing so far, Alejandro. It's a pretty specific one, that one. And look, I'll waffle a little bit here. I guess the reason I don't do that is because creating new plug and plays takes a long time. There's a lot of effort and a lot of time involved with it. The plug and plays I tend to do, therefore, are the ones that have the bigger markets and the ones that are likely to get the best response. Let's set a gauge here. Which, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I don't see there being a huge market for conversions of throttle body intake setups. Pulse width. 0 pulse width, that's interesting. Why have I got 0 pulse width? No, nothing there. I should have actually set the stim up a bit better, shouldn't I? RPM's fine. Cool, it's okay. it for a start. That's a little bit odd, isn't it? Why do I not have any anything going on here? Did I turn something on before? Something a bit more reasonable. Yeah, I mean, I think a breakout board for something like that is probably the better option, and it's it's going to be the perfect setup for having the breakout with the drop bear unit. Let me just turn my scope on here and see what the heck's going on. We've got sync, we're not cranking. Ignition okay. I'm not sure why we're not seeing anything else here. It's all okay. That explains the spark. I had fixed timing set on, so that was set to 0. That's okay. But why am I not seeing any fuel? I wonder if it's something with the new option that we've added. Can't see how it would be, but no, that doesn't make any difference. Improvements to GM7X decoder. Yeah, this is a bit of a funny one. I probably need to find some more data on what's going on, because the decoder that I've written, I'm relatively confident matches everything I can see in terms of the documentation for that particular pattern. And yet it doesn't seem to match what a few people are seeing on the car when they actually try things out. So I'm a little bit uncertain of where to go with that one until I can get my hands on a car to actually test and play with myself. Yeah, that's a good point. That the 24X decoder is actually going to get pulled out at some point. You don't need it. It works perfectly fine with the dual wheel decoder. Did I have a hard limit set on? No, I haven't got anything for the rev limit that I think would be a problem. Hard rev limit's fine. That's all okay. Make sure that's not a problem. That was turned off anyway, so I don't think it should be that. Boost cuts off. That's okay. I'll keep playing away and we'll figure out what's going on there a little bit later. We need to make some changes to... Ooh, not in there. I think to some of these tooltips and things like that. I know it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but these they all need to be updated when we make a little change like this. Ooh, we'll check Speeduino line 1269. Okay, we can have a look at line 1269. Complication to multiply map greater than 0. Yeah, I would have thought that was okay, unless I'm missing something. So 0 should be off. Anything greater than that should be back on. Let's pull that up to one line. Yeah, so Chase, with the 24X, and I do need to update the documentation on this, I really must admit. Just use the dual wheel decoder with falling tooth, with falling edge, sorry, on the crank, and you'll be fine. It'll work much better. And I fully admit that that needs updating in the code, in the documentation. But yeah, it will be, that pattern will actually be getting removed because dual wheel works a ton better. It's a really interesting pattern, that 24X one. It looks like it's completely uneven if you look at a diagram of it. Hold on, somebody actually had it on the forum. Just recently someone asked the question, and it looks like a really wonky diagram. Let's have a look. Just have loads. That one. Yeah, it's actually a really, really interesting pattern. If you look at that pattern, you go, well, that's completely uneven, right? You've got long teeth, and you've got long pulses, short pulses, all this sort of thing. But if you look at where the falling edges happen, they're always one short bit and one long bit apart. So even when it's in an area that looks like it flips, the highs and the lows, the falling tooth edge is always one long section and one short section away. So gap between there and that falling edge is one long and one short. To the next one is one long, one short, one long, and one short. And it means that the falling edges, despite the fact that it looks really uneven, are always 15 degrees apart. Hence why it works perfectly with dual wheel setups. Why have GM made it like this? On their setups, they actually monitor both edges, the rising and the falling, and they can get a faster sync time out of this. They can make it sync within a quarter of a crank revolution, rather than waiting for the cam signal to kick in, which is a whole revolution. So the only reason they do it is to get faster sync, but otherwise it can work as a normal 15 degree dual wheel. Cool. So we're still having this little bit of a funny issue here with the fueling, which is very odd, I must admit. But that's okay. We'll sort these things out. It's probably something to do with my test bench. I'm guessing it's probably not to do with the code that we've added, although you never know. I'm doing these streams on a laptop that isn't my primary development machine, so sometimes things do get a little bit wonky in terms of what's going on with the test rig. Okay, let's have a look at another pull request, because I know that there's a couple out there that people are interested in. Actually, this one. So this is the introduction of a new acceleration enrichment mode or method, I guess. And instead of performing a multiplication, or as a percentage, which we do now, we do it as an adder. So let's have a look. So the big chunk of funny code here is so this is the main section here, is it? Yeah, in the pulse width function. So when we're doing a a multiply type correction, we can do it in the corrections file, which is this A mode multiplier. And if we're doing an adder though, we have to do it further down in the actual pulse width calculation. We can't do it in corrections, unfortunately, which is a little bit annoying. That one, I guess, rubs me the wrong way a little bit, but I can't see any way around that. So a couple of people have asked about this one. I guess I'm not overly familiar with the difference that this will make. I mean, I understand conceptually what this is doing. We're creating an adder for the pulse width rather than a multiplier, I guess. But the difference this makes in tuning is something that I'm a little bit uncertain of. I haven't tuned with it myself, so I'll need to. If we pull this one in now, I'll need to go have a play with it a little bit later today and see how it feels on the car. Okay, there you go. The 24X is meant to sync within 10 changing edges no matter which position you start. So 10 changing edges would be at what, 150 degrees. Okay, so not quite a quarter of a revolution, a little bit over. That's pretty cool. That's cool info, Xian3. I wasn't aware of that, but I knew it was that idea that it was meant to sync faster, but I didn't realize it was within exactly 10 edges. So that's just setting that there. Yep. This is all pretty neat. I don't really have a problem with this. Was it? Okay, there's a couple of conflicts we'll need to figure out. Oh, we can't use the online conflict tool. That's a bit of a bugger. Not sure why we're not getting that option. Okay, so the only thing that strikes me as missing from this, and I'm happy to pull it in and we can add it, is there's nothing in the updates file to set this to the mode to multiplier by default, but that's okay, we can add that in pretty easily. It's alright, we've got that added. Yep, I don't see any issues here at all. But we don't have a online resolve conflictor. That's a bit annoying. Oh, we're telling us we've got to do this the old-fashioned way. That's a bit boring. All right, let's bring it up here. So I don't want to do a publish. Oh, I should have brought my changes in, shouldn't I? Yeah, okay, I didn't want to do that. Store those. Okay, let's actually finish this one off, and then I'll push those up. That'll be a little bit neater, won't it? We're mostly done on that first one. The only thing I really wanted to do, we'll get rid of that. Get rid of that. And we'll update this wording. Directing the pulse by either the map barrier ratio or map divided by 100. Right in there. Going to put a comment in here about why would you'd potentially want to use the 100 option versus the barrow option. So I'm going to say the map 100 option generally used for compatibility with other fuel tables from other ECUs. Barrow ratio is recommended for new tunes. Put a new line there. Now all that's doing, this is just the tooltip that we're updating here. So if we reload this, we'll be able to see that the tooltip for that option is now changed. And it's all these little bits and pieces that are really easy to forget when we make changes, but make it a lot simpler for the user. So if we now look at this option here, we can see that it's got the comments that we just wrote in here. Cool. Let's push that up there now. Always a good idea just to check the changes that you've made and to make sure that you haven't done anything stupid. Oh, well, we haven't actually saved these files, which is another trap to fall into. Okay, that's better. All right. Okay, that's cool. We'll make a new commit and we're just going to call this combine multiply map options into single drop down. Went to right drop there. I wonder why. Okay, we'll push those changes up. Cool. All right, let's while we're waiting for that to push up, and actually I'll show you the work that I'm doing. Vita might be interested in this in particular, just around what I'm doing on the programmable outputs. So this is how the dialogue looks at the moment, which is practical, but a little bit confusing and a little bit all over the place, I think. Don't take that as an insult, it's not meant it. It's just a little bit wonky to sort of look at. What I'm changing it to is something that looks a bit more like this. And this work is not yet finished at all. And this is only a UI change. There's no actual code changes going on here. But I'm making it look a bit like, oh, this is still a bit ugly, it's not finished yet. Where you can select a rule number and it will give you just the options and conditions for that rule. So it's far from finished yet, but it will mean you don't get this huge, big, long, wide dialogue. You just select which rule number you're interested in changing. And obviously that's not right at the moment. And then it'll just simply bring these up, and that's yeah, it's just meant to be something a little bit neater, and we can say that it'll be rule 2. I just need to spend another hour or two working my way through that to make it a bit neater. Like I said, it doesn't change the functionality of the programmable outputs whatsoever. There's not a single code change at all. It's just making it a little bit more straightforward, I think, to select which thing you're going to have. Now, obviously, these dialogues aren't finished yet, but I'll get the first one looking right, and then I'll copy it down for all of the other rules. Okay. It's the most powerful engine Speeduino has run on. That's a really good question. I know of a couple in the 500 range. I know that there's been a few people run some pretty insane engines that I haven't necessarily seen power numbers on. There's at least one, well, at least 2 turbo V8s out there. And there's some really insane power levels on some of the bigger engines. But I don't know. The biggest I've seen is, I think, probably around 550, 560, which was on a turbo BMW engine, 6-cylinder. If you know of any more, that'd be always interested to hear. Okay, let's see if that's updated yet. Hey, we can resolve conflicts now. That's a bit better. Okay, what do we got here that needs resolving? Yep, so we've got the oh damn, we've used the same bit option for the new multiply map as we did for the from the new AE mode. That's a little bit annoying, but we can fix that up. Any reason to remove the status bits from programmable outputs from TS? I'm not sure I know what you're referring to there, Vita. I haven't specifically removed anything there that I'm aware of. If you're talking about just in the UI is not finished, so don't worry about that. I haven't removed anything else, though, I don't think. Yeah, I'm hoping the drop bear will find a bit of interest in the US with their love of 8-cylinder engines as well. Let's have a look at this. 251. No, oh, wrong file. Okay, so the problem here is, guys, that we've the new AE mode option that we were using, or that we were going to pull in, uses bit 7 of this particular config variable, and we actually literally just used bit 7 up now, adding this additional option in. So that's okay. We can fix that up. we will make it use one of the other ones. We'll make it use 5 instead, I think. So just working through a couple other small conflicts that were here. Nothing major. Those are easily done. We'll have a look at globals, and we now see, yeah, we need to make the equivalent change here as well, just to reflect those bits. So we know that this goes down to 1 now. That becomes that option, or that bit, I should say. Easy done. Okay, so we'll fix those conflicts and we'll pull this in. Should be clean now. Yep. And still 35 people on the stream. Wow. I'm amazed at how many people stuck around to listen to me waffle and do coding. Not that I'm sad about that. It's great to see you guys around. It's terrific. Is doing these sort of development streams, just sort of listening to me talk while I work my way through development of things, something you'd like to see? I'm happy to do these a little bit more often if people are interested. Oops. We'll pull those in locally. We'll just discard those changes for the moment. Yeah, the 600 megahertz thing was really just a bit of fun. The Teensy 4.1, believe it or not, for this specific use case, as in for an ECU and the Speeduino firmware, is actually a little bit more limited than the 3.5. The 3.5 actually has more timers available to us than the 4.1. Honestly, with the 4.1's absolutely insane clock speed, you could probably do soft timers and they'd be just fine. But look, it really isn't going to make a big difference either way. All right, so we see now that we've got our new A play mode here. We've got pulse with multiplier, pulse with adder, and we presumably will see that in the dialog here as well. Just load the INI again. Jeffrey, did you just call me a Kiwi? Okay, so we've now got multiplier or adder. Cool. We probably need a tooltip for that one. And actually, if you're ever interested in creating your first pull request and starting with Speeduino, and you want to get something loaded into the firmware, going through and making sure and writing some good tooltips for every option that's in Tuner Studio would be super welcome, because it's a bit of a tedious job and I always mean to do it and then never do. No, Jeffrey, I'm from Australia, not a Kiwi, I'm afraid. Okay, so the only thing we need to really add here, or change here, is we need to add this to the updates. So we set the default value for anyone with an existing tune. Tuner Studio generally should do this, but it's not always 100%, which is why I always like to add our own in here. Okay. Man, last time you used the Teensy was when downgrading your PlayStation 3. Ooh, bet that was good fun. So the other thing to check while all of this is going on is if I bring up Slack for a moment, and my system doesn't completely die, you'll see that in the Git channel in Slack, there'll have been updates pumping through every time we've done one of these pushes through to master, that it'll be running running the tests and everything. And we've actually got a build failed. Yeah, so let's have a look at what happened there. So Travis is the system that in the background, every time a commit is made through to the master branch, it'll run a series of tests in Travis. Now I suspect I know what this is going to be for. We've modified. Ooh, that actually wasn't what I was expecting. We've modified the pulse width function, so I'm guessing that the unit tests for pulse widths are actually going to fail, because we will need to update those tests with these new options that we've added. What is going on here? Command eval. That's an interesting error. Let's make sure we're looking at the latest one here. Okay, if we look down this test run, yeah, we can see that. Oh, look at that! All the pulse width tests have failed, which is not surprising at all. So let's have a look at those tests. Now we can run those tests locally here as well, if we want. Ooh, let me just disconnect here. We have to disconnect from Tuner Studio so that the serial port is now freed up, so we can actually load the tests on. And I've got to go through and do a bit of a cleanup of all these warnings here, because they're getting a bit crazy. So this is going to load the special unit test version of the firmware up, and it's going to put it onto my board here, and it'll run those unit tests, and we should see that the pulse width ones fail. Let's bring up those tests. So these are the tests that we're looking at here. Test pulse width, very large correction, AFR multiply. Now, what will be happening here is, because we introduced a new option, we need to make sure that we're explicitly setting that option when we run these tests. So all we would need to do oh, that's interesting, they actually passed. This is likely due to something that's already on these boards. They've already got the option turned off on these boards, whereas on the test board that these run on, they won't have that option set explicitly because they haven't run this tune yet. We haven't set that option in this tune. So what we probably need to do is, so we've got multiply map turned off for all of these. Which I would have thought would have been what we need. A little trap I actually fell into, and actually only discovered just the other day, is that for any of these that are using packed bit fields, which is what these are, a bit field where we're only using a single byte to store all of these variables. I only discovered the other day that you actually really shouldn't be using true and false on any of these bits. You should be using 1 or 0. Now this one will obviously need to be changed. We'll need to set that to 1, and you would think that true should equal 1 and false should equal 0, but it's not quite that simple. Exactly, it's not a bool anymore. Which if you look at these, you see that this is actually a bool value, or cast to a bool, which is not right. So these should actually be 0s and 1s, which is a bit of a trap to fall into. So we'll just change those to be 0s, which is a bit more explicit and won't land us in any hot water. Cool. So I think they should be right now. Yep. Let's see if we were right. Let's push those up. Yeah, that's okay. Minor lost PR pool. Let's see how that works, whether we get any better results in the tests now. How many drop bear prototypes are out there? 5 at the moment. And in fact, they're not even out there because 3 of them are sitting on my desk still. I've got a few of them I need to get out to people to have a bit of a play with. They're all the Alpha 3 boards. I've got the Alpha 4 board getting closer to ready. Huge changes on the Alpha 4 board. It's been big changes from Alpha 3. Not that there was anything wrong with Alpha 3. There was only, I think, one actual hardware design issue that was found. But Alpha 4 both adds a lot of things onto the board that weren't there previously. It changes the physical layout a little bit to work with the, if you can see this, the intent is that this waterproof USB cable will come up and mount approximately there in the case. This cable is about 1 centimetre too long, so I'm getting these cables custom made. This is just ever so slightly too long, so the full batch will need to be a little bit shorter. And you can see if I show you just the board, you can see that there's a little, if I can figure this out, a little notch here, a little cutout on the board. And that needed to be moved down a little bit more just so that there was enough clearance for that waterproof USB connector to clear the teensy. It was fouling a little bit, so to do that I've had to move the this jumper header down a little bit and tuck it right into the corner. I've gone with a different electrolytic capacity here. I'm going with a flatter one so it can hide actually inside that jumper. Just little bits and pieces, you know, the standard design type stuff that you've got to do when you're coming up with something like this. Okay, so we've pushed that up. That will probably be running a new test now, I would guess. Let's have a look. Yep, so it's now pulled in, Travis has now pulled in that latest commit that we made, and he's running the tests at the moment. Watching Travis run through its tests is actually really cool. It spins up a whole new virtual machine every time you run it, and installs whatever prerequisites you've defined. In this case, I've said install, Doxygen and GraphViz, because it also produces the Doxygen files for Speeduino. It installs Platform IO. Platform IO will go through and do its thing there. Man, another donation, Derm. I can't believe how generous you're being. Thank you so much, man. In terms of the drop betas, I want to do, with the Alpha 4, I expect the Alpha 4, if everything goes to plan, will be identical to the beta boards. And I'm going to get a very small run of the beta 4 boards, or the Alpha 4 boards made, just for myself, probably only 5 boards, and I'll likely only assemble a single one of them. Okay, so it's just about to run the tests now, I think. Oh no, it's just installing, still doing the STM32 framework tests, framework compile, sorry. Yeah, I'll probably only assemble a single one of those boards, verify that everything I've done between the Alpha 3 and the Alpha 4 is electrically fine, and that there's no issues there. And assuming that's all good, I'll go ahead with a batch of maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe 20 beta boards for people, and we can start getting those out there. I need to figure out what the pricing is going to be around those betas. They're not going to be full price at all, but I obviously have to be able to recuperate, to recoup what I'm spending to get them made. I suspect, at a guess, that the beta ones will come out somewhere around the 300, 320 mark, would be my guess. Okay, so it's now writing the test session to my lab board that's in the other room. So it'll run through, and fingers crossed we get some successful tests this time. So this is not happening on this local machine. This is actually a server somewhere in AWS land that's compiled a firmware and is now sending it remotely to a board in my other room. It'll now run the tests. We've still got failures. That's no good. Why have we still got those failing? What I might have to do, and I won't do it now, but I'll do a little bit later, is do a wipe of the board. I'll completely blank its EEPROM, and then run through these tests again locally to see if I get the same result, which is generally what I should do anyway. But what would it take to be part of the Drop Bear beta club? Probably not much. It'll be, quite honestly, probably a first in best dressed for those betas, and that's okay. I'll announce it up on probably the Facebook group when they're ready. In fact, before I do that, I might just sort of put a post up and gauge interest, and say, look, who's going to be interested in one of these? If I get a big response, then I'll do a bigger batch run, or do a bigger beta run. But I guess the thing that people need to keep in mind, and people don't always do this, is that it will very much be a beta. You could get your board and there could be problems with it. There could be hardware problems, it could be anything else, and I really just want to make sure people don't get too excited and dive into these things expecting that it's going to be a production ready unit, because that's not what it is. One of the things I've learned doing all of this is that people do tend to jump in and get involved with things very early on, and it doesn't always. You've just got to set expectations, I think, to avoid disappointment and people being angry and all those sorts of things. All right, I'm probably not going to do a whole heap more today. I can keep. I've got a few things to work away in the background there that aren't going to be particularly exciting for people to watch, so I'll do those in my own time. We'll fix out what's going on with with the issue of no pulse width. I don't think that's going to be a major thing in it. Like I said, it might just be a result of what I'm testing with here. We'll get those sorted. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep working my way through these, what the outputs will look like or what the UI will look like for these programmable outputs. And then we're getting pretty close to getting up for a release, I think. There's not a lot more pull requests that I'm probably going to be seriously looking at for this release. There's maybe a few. This one is probably the other one I need to have a look at and see whether that one's ready to go. Will the whole stream be uploaded? I missed the first 45 minutes. It's automatically uploaded. As soon as this finishes, it goes off and YouTube does a bit of processing in the background, but then it pops up and is available. Yep. And it's at the same URL as you'll be on now, and you can watch the whole thing. Change the Speeduino line 1269 from greater than 0 to not equal 0. That's curious. I'm not sure why that would make a difference off the top of my head. So you reckon this one, you reckon if I do that, it'll work. Let's have a look. Let's see if that brings our fuel back. Not that I'm saying you're wrong, Vito. I'm just a little bit surprised that that would make any difference. But let's have a look and see. Yeah, this one has gone on for a long time, and I kind of expect it to run for about 2 hours. You know, roughly sort of 1 hour running through the new firmware features and 1 hour doing this just mucking about development work. I probably need to go fairly soon and actually have a bit of a Sunday. But I've really enjoyed actually doing this. It's been kind of fun. So if people have enjoyed it, I might do it a bit more often. I was kind of wondering whether I continue doing it on YouTube or move to Twitch or something like that for these development type streams where I'm not presenting something as such. I'm just working through whatever it is I happen to be working on at the moment. But yeah, I'm happy to do them if people are interested. I'm still amazed that there's this many people on and watching. Something's overflowing. That is a really odd one. Let's see what's happened now. No, I'm still not getting any difference. It still looks exactly the same to me, Vitor. It would have been a really odd one to have, but let's just, as a bit of a test, let's just get rid of all of these lines. Where are we? And see if that makes any difference whatsoever. And this is the classic sort of thing where, you know, you bring a new piece of code in and it just needs time to test, I guess, and figure out what all the little issues are. And again, this it might not be related to the new code that we've pulled in. It might simply be something to do with using a different tune on this same test board that I'm running. I have to say, the one thing I really love about the Teensy boards and working with those, and it's probably the same on STM32, is just how much quicker they are at uploading their firmware. It's really painful on Arduino Megas how long they take, particularly when the firmware gets as big as Speeduino's is. It's fine for a little blink sketch, but when the firmware gets bigger, they certainly take their time. Yeah, so we still don't have fuel outputs there, so I think this is probably going to be something to do with the test setup that I've got here. And something a little bit wonky going on with it, but that's all right. I'll sort that out, and we'll get it all fixed up and make sure it's not an issue for the next stream. All right. Look, I think I might look at signing off there for today, guys. If you've got any more urgent questions or anything, drop them in the next minute or so. Otherwise, I guess jump on Slack as always, and we can chat about things. But yeah, new firmware coming out pretty soon, probably within the next few days, a week at the outside limit. We'll have all of this sort of stuff confirmed and making sure that's working fine. But otherwise, I'm going to go and have another coffee and have a Sunday, and hope you guys all have a good day and a good night and whatever it is, and I hope this has been an enjoyable stream for you. All right, guys, have a great day.